Hello. So my name is Casey Corpening, and I'll be talking about the evolution of federal and state education policies and their effectiveness on public education. So the main what for this research project was just, does federal and state involvement, such as the No Child Left Behind Act and Race to the Top, increase the success of students and teachers? Is increased government involvement in public education better for students and teachers? Overall, I will discuss the effect that increasing government involvement in public education has on teachers and students. So most, if not all of the data and research that I did was qualitative and not quantitative. So not a lot of numbers, just more teacher comments and organization comments that have spoke on this topic. So the why, how I became interested in this topic and got to choose this research topic was just that I am going to be a Wake County future teacher, as well as a North Carolina teaching fellow and Meredith College teaching fellow. I grew up in Wake County, largest county, and attended public school kindergarten through 12th grade. So I started in Wake County, ended in Wake County. I have a love for education, but I also have a major interest in politics. When I actually started college, I was a political science major, but decided to change. So I plan to teach in public schools in North Carolina after I graduate from Meredith College in 2022. Okay, so the content-wise, just the creation of public schools. So public schools were created to teach civic virtue, meritocracy, social mobility, social stability, economic efficiency, freedom, and liberty. So just keep that in mind as you reflect on your own educational experience, especially if you were in public schools, especially in the state of North Carolina. Think about if those virtues and ideas are what reflected in your education. So the leaders in creating public schools were people like Benjamin Rush, that good citizens are not just born, they are created. Thomas Jefferson, that students should have public discourse and debate skills. They wanted the cream to rise to the top. Horace Mann, money should be the least of the reasons that we support public schools, as well as Jim Hunt, schools belong to the people. So keep in mind that at the time that these men were speaking and sharing their ideas, public schools were just created for especially white males. There's been a lot of changes that have been made since then, but even at the time, the values of the education that these males were receiving has not changed much to how public schools operate today. So in the 1980s is when you see the real shift in the focus of schools, that schools are for students to get a job. And that's also where you get the idea that students should go to college, and schools are just prepping students for college. And where you also get sort of that first taste of test taking and teaching to the test. So education becomes a federal concern. The federal government uses a complex system of funding mechanisms and policy directives, and that's how they get their reach into what students are learning, how they're learning, and what they're learning, as well as where they're learning. So that gives you the kind of divide between public schools and private schools, because even though private schools are private, the federal government does still have some reach into private schools as well. So Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 was a Supreme Court case that gave African American students and students of color the right to go to school, and that separate was not equal. So that ended segregation of public schools. So in the mid 1960s is when the federal government becomes involved in public education, because Brown versus Board of Education gave them the precedent to reach into public schools. And once you give the executive branch precedent, you usually can't go back. If you would like to, it takes a long time, a lot of policies, a lot of shifts, a lot of changes. And so with that, that also there was a big push from the space race, which was the United States trying to be better than every country in the world and get into space first, meant that the government wanted more prepared students, smarter students, and students that were way more aware of what they were doing in schools, especially the push where you get the push of math and science over the arts. So in 1965, you get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That is where you see the first push for funding for education programs, but it was on a conditional basis, which is actually very similar to another act, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which really wanted to implement data tracking and standardized testing to monitor the progress of schools and make sure that all schools are meeting goals. So more on how education becomes a federal concern. The expansion of federal powers in education took place in 1979 with President Jimmy Carter's establishment of the Department of Education as a cabinet-level government agency. So the Department of Education is a relatively new, in the time span of things, it's a relatively new department or government-level agency that oversees public education. There's been some controversy over whether we should have a Department of Education or whether all of that should be left to the states because education is not mentioned in the Constitution. So you also see more of a federal concern from education in 2001 with the No Child Left Behind Act, which marked a new level of federal oversight by requiring states to set more rigorous student evaluation standards and through testing demonstrate adequate yearly progress. So this is at the time, because I would have been 2 at this time. So entering school in 2005, No Child Left Behind was in place. And that's when I saw the shift or heard of the shift and was taught to the test. So teaching to the test is just that all public school teachers know that at the end of the year, after I believe it's 3rd through 8th grade still, you're going to have a final exam that's usually, in North Carolina, we have EOGs and EOCs, as well as Blue Diamond and a few other tests that take place. And teachers are encouraged to make sure that students have all the information for that test. There is no extra time for emotional development, social development, and all of the other forms of development that students are going through at the time. They are focusing primarily on teaching test material and making sure that students are prepared for a test. So with all of that and federal reach into public schools, a lot of it has to do with money. So cash rules everything around us. So money was the motivator. Economics and education is what made education a federal and state concern. They were looking for the return on investment of schools. If we're putting money into public schools, what are we getting back out of it was the main concern. So that's when you see the shift from schools being to create good citizens and productive citizens to schools being to boost the economy. So if we're putting money into schools, what are schools putting back out for us? And then, so economic emphasis can drown out the good reasons for having a good public school system. They're putting lots of money into public schools at the time and lots of funds for certain schools and focusing a lot on math and science and having students that would go into stocks, that would go into sciences to make the US a global leader. And that's when you see the drowning out of other things that schools were for, such as your social skills, your emotional development, your just overall being a good citizen, and where you also start to see there be a partisan outlook on schools and where schools become a party aligning question. So it's if there start to be differences on how schools operate, when before it was everyone promotes public schools. There is no question. Money goes to public schools because we need good students. And it shifts to, are students going to be the best they can be for the money that we're putting in? Okay. And so just for teachers, there was politics in the classroom, especially recently since like 2012, there's been an increase of should politics be talked about in the classroom, since there are federal policies that go into how things are being taught in the classroom, where students are learning, what they're learning. But it showed that what level of awareness the teachers and students have of federal education policies. They actually only have like they are only moderately aware of policies that are in place outside of district policies. most teachers are aware of what their school requires, what the county requires, but federal policies, most teachers had little understanding of because they don't deal with them directly. And unless you're interested in politics and follow politics strictly, it's probably one of those things that you miss because education policies don't make the news. So with talking about politics in the classroom, students are often sheltered from talking about politics in the classroom because they don't want their teachers are not allowed to show their partisan views, even though the world is still going on around them. So the study concludes that teacher training programs need to better prepare educators in adapting their classrooms to help students understand current events and political upheavals. So this article from the National Education Association really went into how teachers need to be prepared to discuss politics with their students because students should still be in school to become good citizens. So two of the major federal education policies are the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 and the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. So the 2001 Act was under President Bush and the 2015 was under President Obama. So just some of the differences was that in No Child Left Behind, states could only use their own test versus Every Student Succeeds, states can use their own test as well as nationally recognized tests, as well as the 2001 Act. Schools that did not meet adequate yearly progress were labeled as needing improvement and could face federal penalties. That's where you get that schools had to come up with a development plan to put in place on how they were going to fix what was going wrong. And they also had to do that by the subgroups that were struggling and were given a set of instructions to fix the issues. Another thing about the No Child Left Behind Act was that all students had to be brought to proficient level, including special education students. So whether you had any form of a learning disability, any disability, you had to be brought to proficient level no matter what, or else the school would be labeled as needing improvement. So some changes that came with the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, which is still currently in place in 2021, where we sit today. States must consider 4 to 5 factors to measure achievement. So there have been other measures of achievement that have been introduced in this act that would save schools from being labeled as needing improvement other than just testing. This also brought in the universal design of learning, which is a very modern way of teaching and just making sure that all students are getting their education in the way that they need it. So my personal research, I conducted a survey of Meredith alum that have been teaching in the state of North Carolina for at least 5 years. The survey consisted of questions based on policy and classroom environment, such as what were some personal ways that you would measure your student success and why did you switch from one method to another? All of these alumni that were teaching in the state of North Carolina and are teaching in the state of North Carolina were asked what years they taught from and their level of awareness of federal policy and education. So just some limitations to the survey that I found and noticed after it was conducted was that out of the participants surveyed, none were teaching before 2001. And they were not I personally chose to not give them any background information on the policies mentioned, more than one sentence, so just summarizing when it was and what its major focus was. And so North Carolina and county policies may have had an effect on teachers' experiences beyond the federal policies that were mentioned in the survey. So there is the major federal policy, such as the Every Student Succeeds Act, but below that, North Carolina and counties have their own policies in place for teacher conduct and learning styles. So just some comments from teachers that really stood out to me were that the first teacher was a math teacher in Surrey County, and she mentioned that rather than failing entire classes of regular students, teachers just watered down the curriculum and made their grading policies easier so that students could pass without having a strong grasp of any of the concepts. A high school math teacher in Surrey County. So that shows that once the Every Student Succeeds Act came into place, there were higher standards for math. And instead of meeting the standards with the same grading policies, a lot of teachers just lowered their grading policies, so it was easier to pass the class. You also see a shift in performance assessments, which led to, according to this Wake County teacher, a lot of learned helplessness, desensitization, and a lack of motivation regarding tests. Students hated tests. I was a student, I am a student, I hate tests. I don't want to take a test, no one does. And so when teachers began to teach to the test, it got really hard for students to stay motivated and for teachers to stay motivated. Students were struggling to meet the new standards because as teachers, the verbiage had changed and school district was making the material as we were teaching it. So that's something that comes into play with the North Carolina and district standards, such as when Wake County takes on their own form of meeting the Every Student Succeeds Act requirements. And they're writing this material and giving it to teachers as they're writing it. So as soon as that document lands on the teacher's desk, they have to learn something else mid-school year, mid-lesson, and just roll with it. So some common themes that were addressed by teachers that were teaching under ESSA, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, all took place in the last 6 years. So this is when teachers noticed there was additional focus on reaching students who are English language learners, focus on data tracking and growth mindset, the rise of Common Core, and that teachers that were coming in around 2015 were having an easier time transitioning the teachers that had been there for a while. There were also some changes in measurements of student success just from 2010 to now. So some of the ones that stood out were that a lot of teachers promote self and peer assessments, pre and post assessments, as well as portfolios. Portfolios was mentioned a lot in survey results. That was probably the most common measure of success that teachers use. There were not a lot of teachers focusing and saying that they just gave tests. If they did give tests, it was usually pre and post assessments and usually in math or science. So with all that information, what does this mean for teachers? What does this mean for me as a teacher as I go into teaching in a year and a half roughly? It just means that newer teachers are less likely to struggle with change in policies that took place in 2015. Since I am coming in after the most recent policy change, the teachers that have been there for 6 years, which will be 7 years next year, have already become aware of the policies that are in place and the changes that have happened. Unlike the teachers that would have come in 2015, then they were, or the ones that came in 2014, learned everything they could, and then 2015, things completely changed. So I'll just have an easier time teachers that are coming in the next few years. So the No Child Left Behind Act was only in place for 14 years. That is not enough time to fully work something in and have everyone get a good grasp of it and then just cut it off. That's probably not the best way to roll. It showed evidence that students and teachers made them very flustered because teachers are learning new methodology and federal education requirements just to learn completely new ones the next year. So based on the research that I conducted, I think that if an education policy at the federal level is going into place, it needs to stay in place for a long time to work it into the hearts, souls, and minds of everyone that's working with it, which means that if it's an education policy at the federal level, it needs to be well written. It needs to be good, and it needs so that it can stay in place. Okay, and just some implications for students. Forsyth County teacher noted that students were overwhelmed. That's the biggest change that has occurred for students, is that students got really overwhelmed, and students are continue to be overwhelmed with all of the content that they have to get and the fact that they are learning to the test because everything is taught to the test. Students are overwhelmed because they have this pressure on them. You must go to college, you must get a good job. There's a lot less praise of vocational education and things like that, like learning a trade, as there would have been in the early 1900s, but there's been a lot of focus on teaching to the test. This means that students will have to learn how to quickly adapt to change. Students have to be on the go. They have to be like, they have to learn one thing this year and they might learn a different way next year. They have to be able to learn math 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways to get to the same answer. They have to be able to keep up with, hey, you have a test this year, you have a different test next year, you have a different test the next year. This also means that with the change in how things are taught, students can't receive as much help at home from siblings, parents, and guardians, because the way that their parents, siblings, and guardians learn math 10 years ago is completely different from how it is now. And I'm a private tutor. So as a private tutor, I keep up with the ways that teachers are teaching math and how things are changing, as well as staying on top of it. But most parents with their own jobs and careers and lives and other children aren't going to be able to do that. So that's something that students are going to have to adapt to, where they also have to quickly change and adapt. So with the focus on testing, most students are not given an opportunity to fully grasp content. They don't have time to grasp content fully. You have to learn it and go. It's a very learn it and go environment. I was a student in Wake County under the ESSA Act, and I had to learn and go. If I didn't get it, I had to find my own time to get it. It wasn't going to be during class time. If you don't get it, you don't have time to not get it, which is where a lot of the overwhelming comes on to students, because if you don't have time to get it, you are falling 5, 10 steps behind, which is where I get as a private tutor, I go into the mindset of my job is to catch the students that are falling between the gaps. The students that didn't have time to get it, that are having to go out of the class to get this extra help and are needing the push up to get them back to where they need to be. And then that's also where schools are pushing on students and pressuring students to do well in testing so that the school looks better overall. Okay, so that is all. Thank you so much for listening and sticking through. I appreciate it. If you have any questions, please comment them or anything like that. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. Thank you.